Alright, so the first thing I'll take a look at in our shot here is the scale of our effect. So I'm going to go ahead and create a fume container, and I'm going to scale up my fume container to be roughly the size of the effect that I'm used to working with in the past. And this is because at one studio I was at, we had 3 different shows on the go with 3 different scales, and it was definitely an interesting way to work. So once you're familiar with a certain scale, and if the show changes scale, then you can just scale up your fume container and all the values will be in the realm that you're used to working. So for an effect like this first blast, I would probably start with a value of about 250 for scale, and this is just from working in the past that I know that in the turbulence settings, values of probably like 0.5 or 5 and a 0.1 will give me some results that I can pretty much predict the scale of the turbulence based on the size of the grid. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start with this grid size here, and I'm just going to scale up my container until we kind of get roughly around our effect here. So probably around 4. And maybe, and I've got some preset values in my head that I usually like to start with when creating an effect. So there we go. And so I'm just going to go through some of the values here. So now we're using about half a gig of RAM. Let's use about a gig of RAM. And let's just go through the fume container here, and we're just going to set up the basic parameters. We're going to export temperature, velocity, and oxygen. And that's because we're going to use the fire and the temperature, and the oxygen is just going to give it some combustion. So we want to make sure to write those out. And if we look in our camera view here, we're out of frame by frame 50 really, so we only really have to sim 50 frames. And let's set up our path. Let's just call this trails low. And it's the way I like to start an effect like this. I'll just put in some values that I know that is a good start, that I've just kind of memorized from the past. So we're going to lower our iterations just because we're not going to need a high iteration to solve this, so we'll save a little bit of time by lowering this. And we'll keep most of the things at default for now. And we can try the vorticity too. And so I'd highly encourage you to go up to the Fume Docs. And Fume Effects has got really good Fume Docs here with some great images. So in the vorticity too, we've got the option to adjust the scale of the vorticity as well. So we're not going to use that yet. For now, we're just going to keep it at default, but we'll turn it on just in case we want to have the option. And so we go into simulation here. If we scroll down, you can see we have the vorticity 1 and vorticity 2, and this gives you some pretty great examples of the size and scale and the strength. And the vorticity strength we're going to have up at 0.75, and this just is going to give it a little bit more swirling motion and detail in there. So we can try that. And vorticity strength 0.75. And a turbulence start of 0.1 is pretty strong. You'll see that it'll start kicking around the fluid quite a lot. But we'll start for this just so we know the size of the turbulence and what it's going to be doing. Now, using a low turbulence scale, I know that we can get a lot of finer details, and so we'll probably end up lowering this, but I also would like, since they're going to be stringy, just to see what it's like to have kind of a larger scale slowly breaking it up. And let's turn the detail up to 5. And this is going to give it just a lot more detail within the big strokes of the turbulence. It's going to break it up a lot more in the finer bits. And everything else we're going to leave default, really. So that's it for our fume container. And now let's just go ahead and select our particles. Let's rename these first. Trails particles, and let's create a particle source. So let's just change a few values in here. Let's show them in the viewport. If we go to wireframe here, we can see our particle source in the middle there. And it's not quite the size of our particles. That's alright. I'm just going to keep it with a radius of 1 because these particles are quite large. I'd mainly increase the size just to be able to see them while creating the particles. So I'm going to use a radius of 1, and I'm going to turn on the radius controller. And this is a value that if we right click, we can multiply the second radius parameter by any of these attributes. So I'm going to use age, and by putting a 0.5, the particles are slowly going to get smaller over the course of the lifespan. That's kind of what I'm looking for. I just want it to be at a certain value and then die down in scale. So now let's go down and let's adjust the velocity. I'm going to put this to 0.1. And one thing you'll notice in fast moving particles is a higher velocity value, the fluid will catch up to itself and create these mushrooms. So by using a really low velocity, the fluid isn't going to inherit the velocity of the particles so much, and then we won't have these kind of mushrooms. And so moving forward, let's decrease the fuel and the temperature to about half. And this is because, with full values, this will really be a fire burning bit of shrapnel, but I actually want just a little bit of fire at the end, and then I want the smoke to be more smoky, but I want the fire to burn off and just a little fire at the end of these trails. And everything else, let's kind of leave at default here. And let's just add this into our fume effects container. Trails particle source. So there we go. We've set up our fume container with some basic parameters, and we've also set up our trails particle source. So let's go ahead and into our camera here, and let's take a sim of this. Alright, so I just stopped our sim here, and it's looking pretty good, so I'm just going to make a few quick changes here. And for one, just do a quick adjustment to the shading so we can see what we're working with better. And I'm going to go down into the render settings, and we're going to be using, under the color source here, we're going to be shading this as black body. And in the black body shading, we also can define the smoke color, and right now it's just white. And when we get to simming colors, we can put this to grid, and it will use the color if it's been simulated in the grid. Because we don't have any color in the grid yet, we can just turn it to gradient for now, and let's turn the color down to a black or so, dark gray, and we can remove that swatch. That's all we're going to do here. And then in the display settings themselves, we're just going to turn on the GPU shadows, and let's turn this to high, and this will just help us view what we have in the viewport a bit better. Although one more thing, let's just increase the smoke opacity. So in the render settings, opacity here, let's put this up to 20. And maybe let's do a lighter gray. So there we go. Now before we set off another sim here real quick, I'm going to just make a couple of changes, and we're going to change the turbulence. The turbulence here is quite strong, and you can see exactly the scale of the turbulence here. And looks pretty great, although it's quite strong, so I'm going to do less than half. And so I'm going to use a value of 0.03, so about 30% of the turbulence value. And then also, I'm going to go in and let's just half the scale of the turbulence. So You can see the scale here and how long it is. But let's half that, and that should make things pretty interesting as well. And lastly, we're going to lower the spacing to 0.5. And you really need to have a certain amount of resolution to test. You can't really have it that low. So 0.5 value will probably be low enough that we can have a fast sim, but yet we need to be able to see what's happening in the simulation to further adjust our parameters. So let's just take a sim of this. All right, here, so I've just stopped it at frame 42, and you can see the previous sim here at frame 43, and the scale of the turbulence is quite a bit different, and our current sim at frame 42. So I like this a lot better. I like the scale of the turbulence is a lot smaller. And so with this in mind, we're going to go into the next clip and we're going to set up some collisions and make a few more adjustments to the fluid, and then we'll set it off for a high-res simulation.